Journalist, author, historian Anne Applebaum.
The leading commentator on, analyst of Russia, Ukraine.
Extraordinary thinker and historian on the world.
Anne Applebaum, 20 jaar geleden werd ze bekend met haar studie naar de gulags, de strafkampen uit de Sovjet-tijd. Met haar boek daarover won ze een Pulitzerprijs. Rond dezelfde tijd werd Vladimir Poetin voor het eerst herkozen als president. En terwijl het Westen de banden met Rusland vooral goed probeert te houden, bleef Applebaum voor Poetin waarschuwen.
While we were inviting Russia into our institutions, while we were attempting to create a Russia, what was Russia doing? Putin invaded Chechnya, not once but twice. He invaded Georgia.
Ze geldt als een compromisloze havik als het om Rusland gaat. In 2014, na de inname van de Krim, zei ze dit.
We need to think again about where NATO troops are located. We need to think again about NATO strategy.
Applebaum is getrouwd met de Poolse oud-minister van Buitenlandse Zaken Radek Sikorski en is behalve Amerikaans ook Pools staatsburger. 2 jaar geleden verscheen haar boek De Schemering van de Democratie over het oprukken van autoritaire staten. Een recent rapport van de gezaghebbende organisatie Freedom House onderstreept de zorgen van Applebaum. De organisatie constateert voor het 16e jaar op rij een afname van vrijheid in de wereld. Bijna 40% van de wereldbevolking leeft in onvrije landen. In zo'n 60 landen, zegt Freedom House, gaat het achteruit met de vrijheid van burgers. Vanavond sprak ik met Anne Applebaum over haar nieuwe stuk dat deze week verscheen en waarin ze betoogt dat de liberale wereldorde, zoals we die nu kennen, gevaar loopt.
There is a liberal world order in the sense that there are rules and norms, there are international institutions, there's the United Nations, there are assumptions that people make about human rights. But none of those things mean anything if they're not respected, if they're not respected by every country in the world. And none of them mean anything if democratic countries are not willing to enforce them.
Now, your new essay begins with a remarkable anecdote of a speech delivered by the president of Estonia in 1994. Can you talk about what happened and why that's relevant?
So Lennart Meri, who was a really legendary figure, he was the first president of Free Estonia after the fall of the Soviet Union, was in Hamburg in 1994 and did a lecture to a big annual gathering. And he spoke about Estonia and he said how pleased they were to be part of the international liberal world. They were happy to be a democracy. They believe very much in the values of democracy. They believe that freedom creates creativity and prosperity. And then he issued a warning in which he said that, unfortunately, those values are not shared by Russia, which was also a post-Soviet state at that time that was just finding its feet. And Russia is already beginning to act and talk like an imperial power in its old neighborhood, so in the Soviet Union and in the Baltic states. And you know, this lecture was received with curiosity and shock by many in Hamburg, and in particular by the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, who was there and who walked out of the room. And of course, the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in 1994 was Vladimir Putin. So many of the arguments that we're seeing today have their origin 20 and 30 years ago.
So what do you specifically propose Western democracies to do in order to defend themselves?
We need to think a little bit differently about defense. I think NATO needs to think very harder about deterrence, just like we did during the Cold War. What does deterrence mean? How can we make it real? Just relying on Article 5 of the NATO treaty and having sort of annual meetings that are usually very boring isn't really enough to certainly wasn't enough to convince the Russians not to invade Ukraine.
You mainly seem to address European countries, but the US has some very close allies who are autocrats in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, for instance. So what is your message to, let's say, the Biden administration?
Yes, the fact that Saudi Arabia is an autocracy and that Egypt is an autocracy and that they're using their weapons to repress our weapons and our money to repress their own citizens should give us pause for thought, and it's a reason to rein them in. I mean, Saudi Arabia is at the moment an ally of the United States because it fears Iran. And because we're the main market for its oil. But in the long term, there's very little that we have in common with Saudi Arabia, and I hope that the White House understands that.
Are the existing instruments of power that we have right now sufficient, or do we need new ones?
Clearly, the EU needs a security arm. It needs a foreign policy. Theoretically, it has one. In practice, it doesn't. Neither France nor Germany, in particular, has ever been willing to give any power to the EU foreign policy making apparatus. We could use a European army, like a European legion along the lines of the French Foreign Legion, which could carry out tasks. It wouldn't necessarily have to be fighting, but which could be very useful, for example, in dealing with refugees in the East right now. We need, institutions that are matched to the nature of the challenge.
Now, your critics will probably say here is another hawk propagating eventually a new arms race. What is your response?
I mean, there is already a new arms race, and there is already a war with Russia. We just haven't wanted to acknowledge that it's true. This isn't a question of me wanting it or me being a hawk or other people being, anti-Russian. It's not about that at all. It's about recognizing reality. We don't live in a world anymore where we can just assume that, Europe is so powerful that nobody will ever invade it. That is simply not the case. And we're seeing it, we're seeing the results of that incorrect assumption unfold before our eyes right now.
Now, you want democracies to stand firm against autocracies. Yesterday, the EU and China held a virtual summit. Is that the new litmus test to you, our relationship with China?
I don't do litmus tests. I believe there can be nuanced relationships with China. But just so that everybody in Europe understands, China doesn't have Europe's best interests at heart. China is not in the business of enriching Europe in a mutual, win-win situation, even though that's actually the language that China uses. China is interested in dominating its neighborhood. China is interested in changing the rules of the world economy to suit China and the world and world geopolitics. And Europeans need to be aware of that too, and also need to be prepared for the day when it may no longer be possible to trade with China quite so easily as before.
Anne Applebaum from Washington, thank you very much.
Thanks. All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.